and thank you for joining the Alda Kavli Learning Center for our December webinar, The State of Inclusive SciComm, Building a Movement, sponsored by the Kavli Foundation. In case you're less familiar with us, the work that we do at the Alda Center is about empowering scientists, medical professionals, and researchers to communicate their work clearly and vividly to all audiences. Today, we are excited to have Dr. Kaytee Canfield, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and Dr. Sunshine Menezes, the Executive Director of the Metcalf Institute at the University of Rhode Island, joining us to share their findings and recommendations from their most recent report, The State of Inclusive Science Communication, a Landscape Study. Please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will try to get to as many as we can in our time together. And a recording of this webinar will be available for future viewing. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kaytee and Sunshine.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Claire, for the introduction and for all of you for joining us today. So we're going to walk you through some of the findings from this report, as Claire just noted, and also give you a little bit of an introduction to how this came about. So I'm actually going to start with the introduction part, and then Kaytee, who did the interviews for this study, is going to lead you through the findings. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so first of all, before moving on, I'd just like to note that there are very many people who are engaged in this work of inclusive science communication right now. And I want to note that Kaytee and I are the messengers with this study that we'll be talking about here, but we're really grateful for so many people who have been advancing this work and all of the different people whose thinking has really contributed to some of the ideas that we're going to share here today. I also want to note that we define science communication in its broadest sense in everything that we're going to be discussing today. So what we mean when we talk about science communication here is any kind of information exchange that's designed to engage targeted audiences or a specific audience in conversations or thinking about science, technology, engineering, mathematics, or medicine. We added that second M on purpose to STEM, specifically to acknowledge that medicine and healthcare is a very important aspect of inclusive science communication. So with that, there you go. So Metcalf Institute is at the University of Rhode Island, and we provide science training for professional journalists from all over the world, as well as communication training for scientists and other science communicators. So all of that work is intended to foster informed public conversations about science and especially environmental challenges and solutions. We also conduct public programs, and in 2018, we added a really important component to our offerings, and that is the Inclusive SciComm Symposium. You can visit inclusivescicom.org to learn more about the symposium. This was launched in 2018 with a very specific goal and to address some very specific gaps. So there were a lot of, obviously there's been a lot of conversations about public engagement with science and science communication, but the conversations about inclusion and equity and intersectionality in science communication were really very siloed. There were certainly a lot of people who were working on that, but there were very few opportunities for those people to come together and share what they were learning, share their methods, share their successes and their failures. And so we decided to launch the symposium as a way to highlight some of that great work. So with a nationally representative planning committee, we designed this symposium in a fairly short period of time, and we're really thrilled to see a great response to it. And such a great response, in fact, that by the second day of the symposium, people were asking about what was going to happen the next year, which was honestly not something that the planning committee had really thought about at that point. But we were very happy to add a second symposium to the plan. And again, that even though we expanded that 2019 symposium in terms of its duration, in terms of opening up a broad call for abstracts, so it was more crowdsourced than the first time around, it's clear that there is a huge demand for these kinds of opportunities for people to come together across a huge range of disciplines and practices to really share what they're learning. It's also important to note that there are some kind of broader thoughts that are happening with regard to inclusive science communication that we need to acknowledge. So historically, science communication has really happened with a very top-down lens, as in some almighty group of quote-unquote experts get to say which aspects of science are more or less important, and how people, in quote unquote the public, get to engage with those aspects of science. So this very top-down, very hierarchical approach has a lot of problems. It assumes the interests of our intended audiences. It minimizes and often excludes different ways of knowing, different lived experiences, and worst of all, it makes people feel apart from science and from all kinds of STEM. So all of this inclusive science communication work is really an effort to broaden that thinking and to acknowledge that there are all of these different ways of looking at the world and of experiencing the world. And that's what led to the planning committee from the 2018 symposium, the first symposium, to put together this paper, which again, Kaytee Canfield really was the lead author for. There was a lot of contributory and shared thinking among all of the authors on this, but I just want to note that Kaytee did a lot of the heavy lifting on the paper. But we published this paper earlier this year, January of this year, which is kind of mind-blowing. That was this year, Kaytee. And as you can see, science communication demands a critical approach that centers inclusion, equity, and intersectionality. So this was our effort to kind of plant a flag in the ground and say, hey, everybody that does science communication, again, according to that super broad definition that we have, it is time for us to take a very different approach, to make a complete paradigm shift. And so we identified Inclusive SciComm as something that recognizes a number of points, a few of which I'll just highlight for you here. It recognizes histories of oppression, of discrimination, and it centers the voices of those who have been marginalized for a long time, whether those are individuals or communities, centers those voices in all kinds of STEM dialogues. Another thing that inclusive science communication does is it recognizes that a person's individual identities overlap, whether those are related to race or gender or ability or whatever, and those intersectional identities affect a person's status in the world. We also noted that inclusive science communication requires that all of us who engage in science communication acknowledge our own explicit and implicit biases when we are designing any sort of science communication activity, and when we're implementing it, and even when we're evaluating it. And finally, we noted that inclusive science communication is a way to address and redress some of the systemic problems of access in STEM. So obviously that's a lot, right? Like we are simply trying to argue that the entire paradigm of science communication needs to shift. And as I said, this was intended to be provocative. We really want people to start, as the paper says, critically thinking about how they're approaching this work. And this then led to the study that Kaytee is going to tell you more about. So I just want to acknowledge the Kavli Foundation also, which supported this study. Thank you very much to them and for their leadership in this space. So the study is a snapshot. So it's important for us to recognize that. We interviewed 30 people who are early leaders in this inclusive science communication space, with an eye to as diverse a group of people as we possibly could get in all regards. And we supplemented those interviews with a couple of different conversations and focus groups at different conferences that were intended to kind of test the waters of our early findings and see how people responded to them and whether they, felt differently or the same or wanted to expand on what we had been finding from those interviews. A very important one of those conversations that I want to call out happened at the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science, the SOCNIS conference in 2019. Again, I'm really struggling with dates today. In 2019, because that conversation was specifically intended to engage early career researchers and communicators and understand what their specific challenges and needs and opportunities and thinking is about inclusive science communication. And also, Kaytee did a social network analysis, which we're not planning to really talk about today, but that's another piece of the report if you choose to dig in to the whole thing. So with that, I will pass the baton to Kaytee, and Kaytee, just let me know when you want me to forward slides.
Great. So one of the key, or really the main outcome of the study was these 3 key traits that came across in all of the interviews as the things that really ground an inclusive approach to science communication. And so we asked all of our participants, what is inclusive science communication? And this is what came across. So the first one being here, intentionality in your approach in considering the audience, in what is science and who a scientist is, in how we consider how marginalized identities are and have been included in science and science communication. Reciprocity is the second key trait, and that's looking at how communicators and audiences are working together, and there's that give and take, countering what Sunshine was talking about before in that hierarchical approach to science communication. How is there a co-created benefit in your science communication? And then the final key trait being reflexivity. So on the part of the communicator, continually reflecting on your own identities and practices and the outcomes of your work, and assessing, like, are you the right person to do this work, and how might you need to adapt your own work to become more equitable. And that's another important piece here is each of these key traits are important on their own, but alone they are not enough. So these 3 key traits together make inclusive science communication inclusive, all connected through the thread of equity. Also, all of these next 3 graphics were all made by Christine Liu, so we want to make sure we give her credit for that. Yeah, great. So next slide. So along with these key traits, we also identified a number of challenges for the field of, the movement of inclusive science communication. And there's a number of them. So first off were these silos, again, as Sunshine mentioned, of the disciplines that we work in, the modes in which we engage people, and the sectors in which we work. And these create these isolated vocabularies and approaches to science communication that need to be overcome to create a truly inclusive community. Second, there's also a challenge of language barriers, both between these silos and also with so much of science communication being in English. And so there's a need to expand that to other languages. Another challenge being there's a lack of understanding in what these inclusive science communication practices are, and also what inclusive science communication is and who belongs in that community. So our broad definition of science communication sometimes took our participants aback, and they didn't see themselves as science communicators. So thinking through how we can make this movement seem like something we really are all a part of. And then also for early career scientists and communicators, there's the challenge of the financial and professional risk of trying to pursue a career in inclusive science communication, be that due to being graduate students and not having the support of their advisor, or not having the recognition of their expertise. And then another major challenge we noticed was a lack of diversity of the leaders of this movement. At this point, it's, as is seen across science communication, in inclusive science communication as well, it's largely women who are leading the movement, and we want to be wary of that, this becoming a silo for women in science. And then additionally, another challenge is a lack of formal curricula and training in how to do inclusive science communication. And our final main challenge we identified was a lack of institutional infrastructure. So this includes everything from at universities, administrator buy-in, for professors or researchers having incentives, and the reward structure of academia not really supporting inclusive science communication at times, simply resources and funding, something that's probably easy to think of as a barrier there. And so, yeah, this is just this final one of infrastructure is looking at all of these gaps in systematizing this inclusive and equitable approach to science communication. And then we also identified a number of pressure points for the field. So these are things that could inhibit or promote the movement of inclusive science communication. And so we identified them as key things to focus on so that we can advance the movement. So first of all, framing the movement as something that we are all interested in and is relevant to all of us, rather than reinforcing silos of our disciplines or our modes or the sectors that we work in, so that we can all be a part of this together. Another pressure point would be creating spaces for both virtual and in-person collaboration that help us bridge these silos and work in interdisciplinary and intermodal ways. Next, another pressure point is to really support and amplify the work of early career scientists and communicators who have built their communication around inclusion and equity as the default in their approach. And then a final pressure point is funding. So finding creative approaches for evaluation and funding that are grounded in this inclusive approach. So we also identified 10 key recommendations for how we can keep this movement growing and advancing forward. They're not tips and tricks, but they're recommendations that came from our interviewers. So reiterating again, as Sunshine mentioned, we are just the messengers. These came from the leaders in the field. So the first recommendation is to embed those key traits of intentionality, reciprocity, and reflexivity across all of SciComm, so that that qualifier of inclusive SciComm really becomes redundant, so that we can just call it science communication. And this is really the starting point of how to build this movement, but it's not the end. The next recommendation is an essential piece of this, and that's, again, breaking down those silos by working in a transdisciplinary, intersectoral, and intermodal way so that we can incorporate these different ways of knowing and different kinds of expertise. So how do we do that? Looking to literature outside of the fields that we're trained in. So the fields of critical race theory, of multicultural education, work in Indigenous ways of knowing. Those are all areas that have thought a lot about how to center equity in their work, and that can be really helpful in building this movement. We also can build collaborations that aren't solely among researchers, but are working across the spectrum of people who are fully in the practice space and fully in the research space and everything in between. And also moving to build appreciation for people who are working across disciplines in our courses as well, and the way that we train how to do science communication. Our next recommendation is about language and thinking about how we can brand or use language that brings our approaches together rather than enforcing our silos. And this is working across the research and practice spectrum to find a vocabulary that works for everyone. For example, the term outreach is something that some of us may be familiar with in talking about going into communities, working with people, but it has a very unidirectional connotation of you're reaching out to the community. There's not the reciprocal relationship that's so important in inclusive science communication. Another language example that we identified in the way these silos exist between academic research and science communication practice is in science education research that's focused on equity. They just talk about your sense of efficacy or science efficacy. And then in the Twitterverse, the science communicators use the hashtag, this is what a scientist looks like. So they're talking about the same thing of feeling like you belong in science, but they're using very different terms that might not be accessible to both parties. So finding a way we can bring those communities together in our vocabulary. More on language, another recommendation we identified was expanding opportunities for multilingual engagement. So inclusive science communication can help remedy the shortage of culturally and linguistically accessible science communication. There are some situations where languages don't have the same equivalent word for science terms, and this can be an opportunity for science communicators who speak those other languages to explore new methods, decolonial methods to communicate these terms to their communities and audiences. This also is inclusive of ASL, American Sign Language, as another language we can think about how we can expand our reach there. Monica Filio-Moher of Ciencia Puerto Rico has been doing a lot of work in how we can expand our multilingual engagement, especially around COVID. So that's a resource to look to as well. Another recommendation is building those networks so that we can share ideas and resources because we don't want to reinvent the wheel again and again and again. A lot of this work is being done, and we need to figure out how we can connect and find it rather than doing it repeatedly over and over. So we can create transdisciplinary, intersectoral, intermodal communities that are based on shared expertise and interests, like the SciComm Trainers Network, which is focused on how you train the trainers. We can also develop shared resources and disseminate widely. So since our first Inclusive Science Communication Conference, there's a growing long Google Doc of resources that people have been sharing about that fit into that community. Also networking and collaboration via scientific societies like SACNAS or 500 Women Scientists. That's another one that came up a lot, and other associations. And then finally, leveraging highly interconnected organizations to create bridges between individual leaders like the Listen Network. So an example of of these networks, and also going into the next slide, is Reclaiming STEM, which is the Evelyn and Rob are pictured here. They're some of the co-founders of Reclaiming STEM, which is a organization led by these early career scholars to create a sense of science efficacy among historically underrepresented scientists. And so that is another one of our recommendations, is to focus on recruiting and supporting diverse leadership in the science communication movement, in the inclusive science communication movement. And that has to include students and early career professionals. And this was a lot of our conversation with our participants at SACNAS and our focus group, and they identified a number of key things, including this idea that science communication should be inclusive by default. We shouldn't even need to put inclusive in front of the phrase, and that as early career folks, funding can be really hard for them to find. Some of them because they don't have a degree in science communication, sometimes because they lack credibility or support from their supervisors. For these early career folks, it's important for us to support them in how they can, helping them see how they can make this a full-time job. And also for more senior people, the input we got from early career folks was it's important for them to, or for senior people to hold the door open to create space and amplify the voices of these scholars who are building inclusive practices by default in their work. And then our next recommendation is to tackle that issue of lack of curricula and training. So to develop, test, and evaluate inclusive science communication training and learning groups. We've been seeing a lot of great progress, it seems, this year with the online world we've been living in. It's been a lot more accessible in that sense, at least. So one example is the yesstem.org project, which is a collaboration between the University of Michigan and the University College of London, and that's the equity compass you see on the left there, which explores these different pillars of a equitable approach to informal science learning. And then also, of course, the Alda Kavli Learning Center seminars that have been going on throughout the year to build. These are both examples of ways that we can help build our inclusive SciComm competencies. Yeah, and then of course we also need to focus on collaborative approaches to evaluation of inclusive science communication practice. Evaluation didn't come up a ton in the interviews, actually, and that also pointed to us that that's an area that there is a lot of need for growth in, where we can put some focus and going beyond just a tick mark approach of evaluating if things are getting done, but developing more creative ways. And one approach we can learn from the community engagement field is the idea of a democratically engaged assessment. So this is an assessment that stays rigorous, but it is authentic and inviting to full participation. It aims to operationalize our asset-based approach. So recognizing multiple ways of knowing and the key characteristics of inclusive science communication, rather than just having this top-down approach of, did you check off the boxes? And then next, another really important finding for us was validating that people are not solely a researcher or a practitioner in this inclusive science communication space. It is not a binary, it's truly a spectrum of ways that we engage with this work, and that it's really more common that people find themselves as being a practitioner hyphen researcher or researcher practitioner. Many practitioners recognize that they do a lot of research in the design of their programs, and they do ask a lot of questions, even if not in the way that a scientific researcher might formulate their own questions in a purely scientific sense. So looking to adapt this model or adopt a model that allows for moving beyond this binary. And then also funding is another opportunity for us to move this field forward and make it a more mainstream approach to science communication. And that can be in the way that the questions are framed in a proposal of grounding these ideas of equity and inclusivity in the proposal. And just in general, encouraging working across disciplines and evaluation as an important part of the way a funding proposal, or as an important part of the proposal as well. So we also want to acknowledge that this report, again, is bringing together the ideas that already existed. A lot of the time it's pulling together these disciplines and ways of knowing and learning and doing to create a more inclusive approach to our science communication, and really is in an effort to minimize duplicating effort, where we can really more learn from each other and adapt things that are already being done to be done across fields and disciplines. So inclusive science communication really is more powerful than the sum of its parts, and has a lot of opportunity for advancing our communication approaches. So yeah, that's the overview. Thank you all for listening, and we're excited for your questions.
Awesome. Thank you both for that talk. And if you are just joining us, today we are speaking with Dr. Kaytee Canfield and Dr. Sunshine Menezes about the state of inclusive science communication. And we'll now move into answering some questions from the audience. The first one that I have is a general question. That is, where do you see this field of science communication moving in the next 10 to 15 years?
You want to go, Kaytee?
Oh, I'm smiling because I made our interviewees answer that question, and they all felt overwhelmed by it as well. So it's kind of, I feel like I'm getting it served back to me now. I feel optimistic that we will see a shift towards grounding inclusion in the way we ask questions. I think this year we've seen a lot of the opportunities that we have with online science communication, and it's helped us all be a little more creative in the way we define some of our communication. And so I guess I'm hopeful that that will continue even as we transition back to being less socially distant.
And also, this, obviously this year's, the ways that we have had to face up to anti-Black racism and just incredible inequities has forced conversations, some really hard conversations that need to continue, that are not even close to done. But it's forced conversations that are really essential also for inclusive science communication. And if you don't mind, I'd love to segue to one of the questions that came up in the Q&A here, which I think is related to this and really important. So someone noted a question. They said, can an inclusive movement intentionally exclude others? I find the bashing of white women in the report troublesome. I'm not very worried about them being, oh, wait, it just went away. I found it, that's okay. I'm not worried about white women being okay, but I worry about the messaging around it being okay to judge someone based on their race. This seems to be perpetuating the things we're trying to avoid. And I wanted to address that question specifically because we have a lot of, I say this, Kaytee and I are sitting here as two white women. There are so many ways that white women have perpetuated oppression and violence, and it's a reality. It's not a pleasant one, and it's horrible in many ways, but it is a reality. And so we wanted to just face up to that in this report and not try to smooth it over, and just say that if we're doing work that's focused on equity, we must acknowledge all of the hard conversations and have them. So my hope, to get back to your question, Claire, is that in the next 10 to 15 years, we become better equipped to have those really hard conversations for the purpose of serving communities and really making science a more welcoming undertaking.
Those are both great answers. And the next question I have is, in some ways, it can seem dishonest to focus on improving our outreach or communication when the culture of STEM remains very non-inclusive. How can we, as science communicationers, use our knowledge, skills, and connections to address the culture of STEM? It's a loaded question, I know.
Yeah, I think that part of, for me, my instinct is to So I'm in a space now where there's a lot of conversation focused on this idea of outreach. And so I guess for me, I think about if you're in conversations that are like perpetuating those stigmas, like having the hard conversation of countering the narratives of why someone might not be why certain groups aren't included or as what represented in STEM, and encouraging shifting the way we talk about things, and shifting if you're doing both science and science communication, our practices to be these more transdisciplinary approaches that recognize more ways of doing science. I think that those are other ways. It's a big question, and I don't think there's a answer, but that's where I start thinking about it.
I'll only add to that to say that it is hard to separate these things, and I don't know that it's right to separate them or wrong to separate them, but it is hard to do it, and there are many times, for example, in conversations with the planning committee for the Inclusive Cycom Symposia, where we have had to, remind ourselves, like, okay, which ship are we trying to steer here, and sometimes it is both of those ships, and sometimes it's more on the SciComm side. They're really interconnected challenges.
Oh, definitely. And I'm glad that we have experts like you two to help us navigate those waters as we go. The next question I have is, how do you find and identify experts or leaders in inclusive science communication to interview for your study?
That's a great question. So we had a few different advisors on this project who helped us crowdsource among us a list of folks that we all saw as leaders in the field. And then kind of up and down voted who to start our interviews with. And that's basically how we started with our identification of those leaders. And then through the interviews, as Sunshine mentioned, I did a social network analysis. So that's identifying who's connected to whom, who's working with whom in this space. So I asked, who do you see as a leader in this space? I asked these leaders that question. And also, I think a valuable question we asked was, who do you see as an important person in this space who might not be well known? And so that was a way that we made sure we included early career folks who might not have the same household name category as like Bill Nye, as an example of someone a lot of people thought of. So that was how we initially started. And folks who came up across multiple interviews of people who we had already seen as leaders, I prioritized interviewing them. We also really did try our best to have demographics that were inclusive in all of the possible ways. And so that also did play into it. But this also, again, is only 30 leaders in the field. So there are hundreds more people we could have spoken to as well.
Definitely. And then somebody asked that oftentimes they find that white people, especially women, head and steer DEI types of studies and programs. Shouldn't there be more people of color steering that ship?
So good question. And this is complicated. I mean, yes and no, I think would be my response to that. Yes, in that obviously people of color need to be part of these conversations, but we also can't expect people of color to lead all the work on equity and inclusion. And that's what often happens. And especially because that work is not valued in many spaces, especially in academic spaces. It's just, really hard emotional labor that is uncompensated and even devalued, actively devalued. So this is a time when we need a lot of different people to engage in these things. And I also want to reiterate that when we're talking about marginalized groups, we are certainly talking about race and ethnicity here, but we're also talking about the disabled. We're talking about people who are LGBTQIA+. We're talking about people, with different languages, like there are many, many ways in which people are marginalized. And so we are urging people to think just much more broadly in terms of how we conceive our efforts to be inclusive and equitable. That's not what was asked, but I just think it's important to make that reminder.
Yeah, I agree with Sunshine that yes and no. I think I'm guessing a lot of us have had this conversation this year, but it's not the job of marginalized populations to hear like white tears, right? That's a job among other people of that same community to help people process those emotions. So in that regard, no, I don't think that's the job of marginalized people, but absolutely, we should amplify voices of leaders in this field, and they should be leading their own projects as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And the next question I have is from Patricia, and they ask, should grant funding agencies require more inclusive science communication of research findings?
Yes.
They ask because it's hard to see how many PIs will change their plans or expand their plans unless it's required to do so by these funding agencies.
Yeah, chicken and egg, right? So this was actually why we very explicitly added the recommendation about funders in the report. We wanted to make it clear that funders have a very important role to play. And there are all kinds of ways, some of them Kaytee mentioned. There are so many ways that funders can address these various issues, in addition to the points that Kaytee's already made here, requiring substantive involvement of early career researchers and communicators in your research efforts, providing those opportunities for leadership for the early career people who are bringing really innovative and inherently inclusive practices. So there's just a lot of ways that funders can be driving these conversations. And again, some funders are stepping up for this. And I give the Kavli Foundation huge credit for this, as well as others, a few others, but not all funders. And even, so for National Science Foundation proposals, you need to attend to broader impacts and broadening participation, but often that is done in a very superficial way by a lot of researchers, in their proposal. So I'd be thrilled if we saw NSF, put more stake in the game for meaningful efforts to do what we call inclusive science communication.
That sounds great. And I would look forward to a lot of those organizations, including things such as that. Next question is, in light of the recommendations outlined in the report, do you both have a sense of what might be a good home for this movement? This might be organizations or folks who are well poised to lead this collaboratively. This person would just like your thoughts and guesses on this question.
So I think it doesn't belong within a department or something like that. So I guess I don't have an answer of where exactly it does land, but I guess I feel like it needs to exist in multiple places, right? And I think that's a big part of our point is that it takes a whole bunch of different experts. So I think it belongs more in a space that explicitly encourages the collaboration of research and practice and engagement with communities. But where exactly that is, I don't know. Sunshine, I don't know.
Yeah, I feel really strongly that this shouldn't belong to any place. This is, I mean, so we started the symposium. We intend to continue to do this every other year moving forward. The next one will be October 2021. Mark your calendars. But that's obviously not enough. Like there need to be convenings to discuss this, from like your lab to your like program to your institution to like regional meetings, whatever. Like the more of these conversations, the better. The more we can integrate the skills and competencies of inclusive science communication into formal curricula as well as training, like professional development, the better. The more people who are learning how to really do this work intentionally, reciprocally, reflexively, the better it is for everyone. So, yeah, so I mean, we're here pushing on this movement, trying to support it as we can, along with a lot of other people. But yeah, the more the merrier, and it's essential. Not just merry, but the more the better, and the faster this happens. The more we get to that point, as Kaytee was saying before, where we don't need to call this inclusive science communication anymore. It's just science communication, or some other better word that has yet to be devised.
That's great. And then, do you have any suggestions about where to start when it comes to evaluating inclusive science communication? This person feels like they all know that we should do that, but they're not sure, besides doing a quick survey of the attendees. Do you have any recommendations for this friend?
I'll jump in just to note that so I can't point you to like a specific source for this, unfortunately, but I would argue that that we need to be moving away from just the easy metrics, and this is part of the funding situation, right? Because to do inclusive science communication, it requires relationship building, which takes much longer. And so like the timelines of grants need to be adjusted to account for relationship building. And also the budgets of grants, therefore, need to be adjusted because of the timelines, but also to do this evaluation in ways that are substantively adding to what we know, and helping us to improve our efforts and have better outcomes, but also not taking away from the work itself. So this is a challenge, obviously, but it is not it's a challenge that can be overcome. So yeah, I don't think there's any like silver bullet to this. It is the thing that we argued in the report was we need creative, collaborative approaches to evaluation. There can be ways to evaluate our work that go way beyond the things that we often think about, the surveys or the focus groups, to use your examples, but maybe the problem is that we're not like bringing enough people in to think about it from the beginning in terms of the questions that we're asking and what we're trying to achieve.
That's a very good point. Yes.
Yeah, I don't have a solution, but I think it is thinking about how we can like measure outcomes, and not just, someone made this comment in the chat, Alexandra made a comment in the chat, it's not just like how are you feeling right after this, but what happens as a result of your communication farther down the line. And then again, that goes to funding timelines, right? Like the grants that usually end pretty soon after. They do usually end soon after the project is done, and not allow for that longitudinal measurement. So that's something else we need to get creative about.
Definitely. And Margaret asks, how can or do non-scientists, so people without formal science training, and science communicationers contribute to the inclusivity of science communication? How can they?
I'm sorry, I was responding to something in the chat. That's why I haven't been responding to the chat, because I can't pay attention to two things at the same time. Could you repeat that question, please?
Of course, yes. So aside from the findings and implications that you post in your report, how can or do non-scientists, so people without formal science training, non-scientist science communicationers, contribute to the inclusivity of science communication?
So I think that comes back to like the way we think about what is science. So like not having a formal science training doesn't mean you're not a scientist, right? So a lot of my favorite stories from the interviews were people talking about how they got excited about science from learning from their grandparents how to cook and learning about the chemistry of baking and things like that. That's all science. And so I think one way is you can encourage inclusivity by reframing the way we think about what science is and helping those folks you're communicating with see that you can be a scientist even without a bachelor's degree or any other degree in a scientific field.
Yes.
Awesome. And then somebody asked, how could storytelling through media be used as an effective tool for getting this movement into alternative spaces? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I think this is, so this is all options on the table, right? That's what it should be. So the part of our understanding of what's happening right now in inclusive science communication is this challenge of the silos of people, whether it's disciplinary or in sectors or in modes. And by modes, we mean exactly like the settings and the specific techniques that you're using. And unfortunately, often, even the settings and techniques are really siloed, and the people who do this work in a particular setting or using a particular technique are really focused on just that approach. So I think that storytelling and film are aspects of our specific tools and approaches that are being used and can be used even more widely to both demonstrate what inclusive science communication looks like and to practice it. I'm not sure if that was the question, if I interpreted that correctly, but that's how it hit me.
Yeah, thinking of, so I don't know is Kendall's documentary widely available? I know that at our first Inclusive SciComm Symposium, Dr. Kendall Moore presented a documentary that helped us explore some of these ideas of what inclusive SciComm is. And I'm pretty sure she's doing a follow-up or did a follow-up as well. And then I'm also, of course, thinking of all the work the Story Collider does in helping us think about science in an inclusive way. So I think there are a lot of different ways that storytelling can be a mode to practice inclusive science communication and help other communities that don't traditionally engage with science or don't think of themselves as people who engage with science daily to have access to these ways of thinking too.
Definitely, thank you. And this is just a general one, and I know that we defined this earlier in your talk, but could you, again, for the participants, let us know how you define science communication?
We have a super long definition, to be honest, and I encourage you to take a look at that Frontiers in Communication paper. I think Clara shared it earlier in the conversation, so it's in the chat somewhere. And that gives this, 12 bullet list of all the things that we say are included. But some of the highlights for how we define inclusive science communication are that it relates to acknowledging history and the role of history, acknowledging people's lived experiences and especially their intersectional lived experiences, acknowledging the biases that we as science communicators, regardless of who we are, bring to the work that we do. And there's a lot of other things too, but those are some of the really key things. You know, we very explicitly reject the so-called deficit model, the idea that people are empty vessels that we experts are going to fill up, but rather that communication should be about focusing on what people bring to the conversation, rather than what they lack, quote unquote.
And then just the science communication, more general science communication, we broadly define it. I'm just reading it from the report here is, now I don't even see it, but it's like any approach to communicate or engage populations around scientific topics. Like that's my effort at paraphrasing it, but it's really just any effort to, engage people with science.
Thank you. And then looks like we'll have time for 2 more questions. One of them comes from a senior strategist at the Wikimedia Foundation who's beginning work on climate change communication. And they would like to know your report recommends finding multilingual opportunities for communication, but there aren't any concrete recommendations for platforms or tools. Where are you recommending experts look for public venues to reach these audiences?
So again, I'm not sure if I'm interpreting the question correctly, but what we were really advocating for in the report is that communicators bring in and or start from multilingual, like a recognition of who your audience is, right? Like, who are you trying to engage in your conversation? So foundational question for all science communication. And are you, like, who's missing? Are you not reaching people because you are only offering your effort in, say, English? And so again, there's a paper that someone shared in the chat earlier that we referenced in the presentation that also was in that same special issue about inclusive science communication from Frontiers in Communication, the journal Frontiers in Communication, earlier this year. Highly recommend that entire special issue. It's all open access, a ton of really great stuff in there. But that particular paper is one that says, you know, there are so many opportunities for multilingual engagement. So again, this is if you're doing work and you're thinking like, no one on our team is fluent in another language, find a partner who is, you know, like if you're trying to reach a particular audience that is being underserved because English is not their primary language, find partners. So this is the collaboration part of this is huge. It is absolutely essential that we all do a better job of finding partners to look to who can help us with this work. So I just see in the chat, Lizette noted the National Coalition for Latinx with Disabilities. This is another example of a great group to partner with. So there are a lot of organizations out there, small to large, who are doing really important work and are trusted in a particular community that you may want to engage with, you know. So those trusted partners are really important.
That is a great note. And I think that's something that we can all take away from this talk is to really think about the audiences, like you said, of who we're missing, and then who can we collaborate with to reach those audiences themselves to help expand the field of inclusive science communication. And You briefly mentioned a few of these organizations, but are there any others that come to mind when you can think of who are already practicing inclusive science communication that our attendees might look to collaborate with?
Kaytee, do you want to go?
So yeah, we mentioned SACNUS, which is who we worked with before. I know, so ARIS, which is Advancing Research Impact in Society, is that right? Is another organization focused on like broadening participation, and CAISE, CAISE. They've done a lot of work on broadening participation in STEM. And then, in Europe, Excite, which is, I always forget how to spell it correctly.
ECSITE.
Okay, yeah, that's more in like the museum space, but those are all organizations that I know I've read reports from in doing this work.
There's the Museums Are Not Neutral movement. If you're in the museum space, you can find, that's not an organization, it's really like a broader group of people. But you can find people who are actively engaged with that. We mentioned Ciencia Puerto Rico before. They're doing incredible work. Yeah, it really depends on your specific interests, but the starting point is to recognize that there are groups. I mean, pretty much always there is going to be an existing group out there who can be a great partner. But the really important thing is to not treat that partnership as a transaction, but to make sure that you're in fact bringing out those key traits of inclusive science communication in and really pursuing a collaboration with any partner group that you want, whether it's a formal organization, or it is a community, or it's an individual. I mean, that's a really important piece of this.
Definitely. And it looks like the attendees in the chat are singing that praise to making that statement. So thank you very much. And with that, it looks like we have come to our time. I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in to today's talk, and definitely thank you to our speakers for their time with us today. I invite you to check out Kaytee's and Sunshine's report and all the resources that were shared today, just to learn more about the movement of inclusive science communication, and especially as we go into working in the new year itself. We have a quick 6-question survey that for all of you to participate in that will appear immediately after this webinar ends. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. And then finally, we would like to again thank the Kavli Foundation for their generous support for making these webinars possible within the Alda Kavli Learning Center. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you again in the new year. Thank you.